The morning alarm echoed through the massive corridors of Centauri Station, and Tom pulled his collar higher as he walked toward the supply closet. 3 years of this routine had made him nearly invisible to everyone around him. The alien cadets rushed past him in their perfectly pressed uniforms, their voices mixing in dozens of different languages as they hurried to their morning classes. Tom grabbed his cleaning supplies and started his daily rounds. The Galactic Military Academy was home to the brightest young minds from across known space. Tall reptilian warriors practiced combat formations in the main hall, their scales gleaming under the artificial lights. Crystalline silicon-based beings worked on complex mathematical problems, their bodies creating soft musical sounds as they calculated. Energy beings floated through the corridors like living clouds of light, discussing advanced physics theories that hurt his head just to listen to. And then there was Tom, human maintenance worker, nobody special. He had learned to move quietly through the academy grounds. When he cleaned the tactical rooms, the instructors barely glanced at him. When he repaired equipment in the laboratories, the students treated him like furniture. It was exactly how he wanted it. The high collar of his work uniform hid the tattoo on his neck, and his simple human appearance made him forgettable. The reptilian cadets were the worst. They came from warrior cultures where strength meant everything. To them, humans were soft and weak. The silicon-based students were more polite but equally dismissive. They viewed humans as intellectually limited compared to their crystal minds that could process thousands of calculations per second. The energy beings were the kindest, but even they saw humans as primitive creatures who had only recently learned to travel between stars. Tom didn't mind. Being underestimated had its advantages. As he cleaned the windows in Classroom 7, he listened to Professor Helt teaching military history. The old energy being was discussing the Battle of Rigel Prime, where 3 different alien fleets had worked together to defeat an enemy force. Tom noticed several tactical errors in the professor's explanation, but he kept quiet and continued scrubbing the glass. After the class ended, Tom stayed behind to empty the trash bins. Professor Helt was organizing his notes when he dropped a datapad. Tom quickly picked it up and handed it back. "Thank you," the professor said, his voice like wind through chimes. "You're very observant for a maintenance worker." Tom just nodded and continued his work, but he felt the professor's glowing eyes watching him as he left the room. Later that day, Tom was repairing a broken air recycler in the dormitory section when he overheard 2 reptilian cadets talking. "The simulation systems have been running much better lately," said the first one, a female with bright green scales. "Yeah, and the security doors respond faster too," replied her companion. "Someone must have upgraded the software." Tom smiled to himself as he worked. The Academy's systems had been running on outdated protocols when he arrived 3 years ago. It had taken him months to carefully upgrade everything without being noticed. A small improvement here, a minor adjustment there. Nothing dramatic. Enough to draw attention. The truth was, Tom understood these systems better than most of the instructors. He had worked with similar technology before, in places far more dangerous than a school. But that was a different life, and he preferred to keep it buried. Admiral Corvin arrived at the Academy that afternoon for his weekly inspection. The stern reptilian commander walked through the halls with military precision, checking everything with his sharp yellow eyes. Tom had learned to stay out of the Admiral's way during these visits. Corvin was old-school military and had no patience for what he saw as human weakness. But today was different. As Tom cleaned the main computer room, he could hear Admiral Corvin talking to the Academy's director in the hallway. "The efficiency reports are remarkable," Corvin was saying. "Equipment failures are down 60% from last year. Security response times have improved dramatically. Someone has been making significant improvements to our systems." "We haven't authorized any major upgrades," replied Director Ashton, a middle-aged human woman who ran the Academy's daily operations. "Then who is responsible for these changes?" Corvin's voice carried the tone of someone who didn't like mysteries. Tom finished his work quickly and slipped out through a side corridor before they could see him. He had been careful to make his improvements gradually, but apparently they were more noticeable than he had hoped. That evening, as Tom was cleaning the dining hall after dinner, he watched the cadets socializing. The different species had formed natural groups based on their backgrounds. Reptilians sat with other reptilians discussing combat techniques and military traditions. Silicon-based beings gathered around complex holographic puzzles that would challenge even advanced computers. Energy beings floated near the windows, their forms shifting as they shared electromagnetic thoughts. A few human cadets sat at a small table in the corner. There weren't many humans at the academy, and the ones who made it here were usually the absolute best their species had to offer. They worked twice as hard as everyone else just to prove they belonged. One of the human cadets, a young man named David, was struggling with his quantum mechanics homework. Tom could see the equations from across the room, and he knew exactly where David had made his mistake. It would be simple to help, but that would mean drawing attention to himself. Instead, Tom continued cleaning, moving slowly closer to David's table. When he emptied the trash bin nearby, he accidentally knocked over David's water glass. As he helped clean up the spill, Tom's cloth happened to smudge out the incorrect equation David had written. "Oh, sorry about that," Tom said quietly. David looked at the smudged equation and suddenly saw his error. "Actually, that helps. I think I see what I did wrong now." Tom nodded and moved away before anyone could notice the exchange. It was a small thing, but it felt good to help. These young people were the future leaders of their civilizations. They deserved every chance to succeed. As Tom finished his evening rounds, he reflected on his 3 years at the academy. He had come here with a specific mission, though none of the faculty or students knew about it. His job was to observe, to protect, and to remain invisible. So far, he had succeeded perfectly. But as he pulled his collar higher and headed back to his small quarters, Tom didn't notice the crystalline form of Cadet Nira watching him from the shadows. The silicon-based student had been observing the quiet human maintenance worker for weeks, and she was beginning to suspect that there was much more to Tom than met the eye. The emergency alarm shattered the peaceful morning at Centauri Station like breaking glass. Tom was replacing light panels in the main corridor when the piercing sound made every cadet freeze in place. Red warning lights flashed throughout the academy, and an automated voice began repeating the same message over and over. "Emergency drill in progress. All personnel report to designated safe zones immediately." But this wasn't a drill. Tom could smell the sharp, bitter scent of burning plasma from the direction of the training halls. Real emergency alarms had a different tone, and his trained senses picked up the subtle difference immediately. Something had gone seriously wrong. Chaos erupted around him as hundreds of alien cadets tried to follow emergency procedures they had only practiced in simulations. Reptilian students pushed toward the exits with their natural warrior instincts, while silicon-based beings moved in precise formations but too slowly. Energy beings flickered with panic, their usual graceful floating replaced by erratic movements. Tom dropped his tools and ran toward the source of the problem instead of away from it. In the main training hall, he found the cause of the emergency. A plasma conduit had ruptured during a combat simulation, and toxic green gas was pouring into the room. Several cadets were trapped inside, coughing and stumbling as the poisonous fumes filled their lungs. Without thinking, Tom grabbed an emergency breathing mask from the wall and ran into the gas cloud. His training kicked in automatically, and he began coordinating the evacuation with the kind of military precision that would have impressed any drill instructor. "You three, form a chain to the exit," he shouted to a group of confused reptilian cadets. "Silicon students, use your built-in air filters to help carry the others. Energy beings, spread out and provide light so everyone can see." Tom's voice cut through the panic like a command from a senior officer. The alien students found themselves obeying without question, responding to the authority in his tone. Within minutes, he had organized an efficient rescue operation that saved everyone in the training hall. As Tom helped the last cadet to safety, a piece of broken metal caught his uniform collar and tore it badly. The fabric ripped from his shoulder, down to his chest, exposing part of his neck. In the confusion and smoke, most people didn't notice, but Cadet Nira was watching from the safe zone, and her crystalline eyes caught sight of something that made her entire body ring like a struck bell. There, on Tom's neck, was the edge of an intricate tattoo. Geometric patterns in dark ink formed, complex shapes that seemed to shift and move in the flickering emergency lights. Nira had studied military history from dozens of civilizations, and those patterns looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she had seen them before. Tom quickly pulled the torn fabric higher to cover his neck, but it was too late. He had seen Nira watching him, and the look in her crystalline eyes told him she had noticed something she wasn't supposed to see. Over the next few days, Nira couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed during the emergency. Tom had moved through that toxic gas cloud like someone who had faced similar dangers many times before. His commands had been precise and effective, showing a deep understanding of how different alien species would react under pressure. Most humans would have panicked or gotten confused trying to coordinate so many different types of beings, but Tom had known exactly what to do. Nira began paying closer attention to the quiet maintenance worker. She watched him during his daily rounds and noticed things she had missed before. The way he positioned himself to hear important conversations, how his eyes tracked multiple people at once, like someone maintaining tactical awareness. The fact that he seemed to know the academy's layout better than students who had been there for years. She also started investigating Tom's personnel files, using her status as a top student to access the academy's databases. What she found was disturbing. Tom's background information was surprisingly limited for someone who had worked at the academy for 3 years. His employment history before arriving at Centauri Station was almost completely blank. Professor Helt was also becoming suspicious. The elderly energy being had decades of experience reading people, and something about Tom's behavior during the emergency had triggered his instincts. He began testing the human maintenance worker in subtle ways. During his military history lectures, Professor Helt started discussing complex tactical scenarios while Tom was cleaning nearby. He would present theoretical problems involving multi-species warfare, the kind of advanced strategies that even senior cadets struggled to understand. Tom tried to ignore the lectures and focus on his work, but Professor Helt was clever. He would deliberately include obvious mistakes in his explanations, tactical errors that any experienced military mind would find painful to hear. Without realizing it, Tom began responding to these errors. He would position his cleaning equipment in patterns that mirrored proper fleet formations. He would mutter corrections under his breath when the professor described flawed battle plans. Professor Helt noticed everything. The way Tom's body language changed when certain classified operations were mentioned. How he automatically calculated firing solutions when ship combat was discussed. The fact that he seemed to know details about battles that weren't in any public records. The situation grew more complicated when Cadet Vorth decided to make Tom his personal target for harassment. Vorth was a reptilian from one of the warrior castes, and he had never liked having humans at the academy. To him, they were weak creatures who didn't deserve to share space with superior beings. Vorth started small, accidentally knocking over Tom's cleaning supplies or blocking his path in the corridors. When Tom didn't respond with anger or fight back, Vorth became bolder. He began making loud comments about human weakness whenever Tom was within earshot, trying to provoke a reaction. "Look at that pathetic human," Vorth would say to his friends, "crawling around on the floor like a servant. This is what happens when inferior species try to mix with their betters." Tom endured the harassment silently, keeping his head down, and continuing his work. But his calm response only made Vorth more frustrated. The reptilian cadet was used to intimidating others, and Tom's lack of fear confused and angered him. Things came to a head when Vorth cornered Tom in a storage bay after classes had ended for the day. The reptilian student was twice Tom's size, with muscles that could crush steel and reflexes faster than most humans could even see. "I'm tired of you pretending you belong here," Vorth snarled, his forked tongue flicking out to taste Tom's fear. "Why don't you explain to me how a weak little human servant thinks he can give orders to his superiors?" For just a moment, Tom's carefully maintained facade slipped. His posture shifted into something that looked almost like a fighting stance. His eyes assessed Vorth's position and movement patterns with the cold calculation of someone who had faced much more dangerous opponents. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, but then Tom caught himself and returned to his submissive maintenance worker role. He apologized quietly and tried to leave the storage bay. Forth let him go, but the brief glimpse of something deadly in the human's eyes left him feeling oddly unsettled. Admiral Corvin continued his weekly inspections, and each time he grew more puzzled by the Academy's improved efficiency. Security systems that had been installed decades ago were now running like new equipment. Training simulations that used to crash regularly were operating flawlessly. Even the food service equipment in the dining halls was working better than it ever had. Someone with extraordinary technical skills was systematically upgrading every system in the Academy, but they were doing it so carefully that no one could figure out who it was or how they were managing it. The Admiral began paying attention to patterns, looking for clues about when these mysterious improvements occurred. He noticed that the upgrades seemed to happen during off hours when most people were asleep. He also observed that certain areas of the Academy became more secure whenever the human maintenance worker had recently been assigned to clean them. But Admiral Corvin was a practical military commander, not a detective. He had more important things to worry about than maintenance schedules and system upgrades. As long as the Academy was running smoothly, he was satisfied. He had no idea that the answers to his questions were walking past him every day, hidden behind a torn collar and a carefully maintained disguise of ordinary human weakness. Nira spent every free moment in the Academy's computer labs, digging deeper into Tom's background. Her crystalline mind could process information faster than most supercomputers, and she used every bit of that ability to investigate the mysterious maintenance worker. The more she searched, the more confused she became. Tom's employment records were too clean, too simple. Most people left digital footprints everywhere they went, but Tom's past was like a carefully erased slate. His previous job history listed basic maintenance work on cargo ships and mining stations, but when Nira tried to contact those employers, she found that many of the companies no longer existed or claimed to have no record of him. More troubling was what she found when she analyzed the Academy's system improvements. Every upgrade bore the signature of someone with advanced military engineering training. The security protocols had been modified using techniques that were classified at the highest levels. The tactical simulation programs now included combat scenarios that weren't supposed to exist in civilian databases. Whoever was making these changes had access to information that should have been restricted to elite military units. Nira's investigation was interrupted when she discovered something else interesting about Tom's daily routine. He wasn't just cleaning random areas of the Academy. His work assignments followed a pattern that put him in position to observe almost every classified briefing, training exercise, and strategic planning session that took place. Either Tom was the luckiest maintenance worker in the galaxy, or he was deliberately positioning himself to gather intelligence on the Academy's operations. Meanwhile, Professor Helt was conducting his own investigation through more direct methods. The elderly energy being had decided to test Tom's knowledge systematically, using his lectures as bait to see how the human would respond. During a class on interstellar warfare, Professor Helt presented a tactical scenario involving a three-way battle between different alien fleets. He deliberately included several strategic errors in his analysis, the kind of mistakes that would be obvious to anyone with real combat experience. Tom was cleaning the windows at the back of the classroom, apparently paying no attention to the lecture. But Professor Helt watched him carefully, and he saw the subtle signs. Tom's hands hesitated when the professor described a flawed flanking maneuver. His shoulders tensed when an obviously wrong supply line strategy was discussed. When Professor Helt suggested a battle formation that would leave ships vulnerable to crossfire, Tom actually turned to look at the tactical display before catching himself. After the class ended, Professor Helt lingered in the classroom until only Tom remained, finishing his cleaning duties. "That was an interesting lecture," Professor Helt said casually, "though I suspect some of my tactical analysis might have been questionable." Tom continued wiping down desks without looking up. "I wouldn't know about military tactics, Professor. I just clean things." "Of course," Professor Helt replied. "But," his voice carried a note of skepticism, "still I find it curious how much you seem to absorb during these sessions." Most maintenance workers tune out academic discussions. Tom finished cleaning and gathered his supplies. I find history interesting, that's all. As Tom left the classroom, Professor Helt noticed something that confirmed his growing suspicions. The humans' cleaning supplies were arranged in his cart, according to a very specific organizational system. It was subtle, but Professor Helt recognized it as a military logistics pattern used by Special Forces units to ensure quick access to essential equipment. No ordinary maintenance worker would organize their tools that way. The tension between Tom and Cadet Vorth continued to escalate. The reptilian student had convinced himself that the human was somehow mocking him by refusing to show proper fear. Vorth began following Tom during his work rounds, making increasingly aggressive comments about human inferiority. I heard humans used to live in caves and eat raw meat like animals, Vorth would say loudly as Tom cleaned nearby areas. Maybe that's why this one is so comfortable crawling around on the floor. Other cadets began to notice the harassment, but most ignored it. Bullying maintenance staff wasn't uncommon, and humans were considered fair game by the more arrogant alien students. A few of the human cadets looked uncomfortable when they witnessed Vorth's behavior, but none of them were willing to challenge a warrior caste reptilian. Tom's response to the harassment was what puzzled everyone the most. Instead of showing anger, fear, or even resignation, he seemed almost amused by Vorth's attempts at intimidation. Sometimes, when Vorth was being particularly crude, Tom would get a small smile on his face as if he were enjoying a private joke. This reaction infuriated Vorth even more. He was used to his victims cowering or fighting back, not treating him like entertainment. The situation reached a boiling point during a tactical exercise in the Academy's main simulation room. Students were practicing fleet command scenarios, and Tom was assigned to maintain the holographic projection systems. Vorth was commanding a small squadron of simulated ships against a computer-controlled enemy force. The exercise was not going well for Vorth. His aggressive tactics were leaving, his ships vulnerable, and he was losing vessels faster than he could destroy enemy targets. Other students began whispering and pointing as Vorth's fleet was systematically destroyed. In his frustration, Vorth noticed Tom working quietly at a maintenance panel nearby. The human was adjusting the holographic projectors, but his eyes kept flicking to the tactical display. Vorth was convinced that Tom was somehow sabotaging his performance. "Human," Vorth shouted across the simulation room. "What are you doing over there?" Tom looked up from his work. "Just calibrating the display system, sir. The resolution was slightly off in Sector 7. "Liar," Vorth accused, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You're interfering with my simulation." The other students stopped their exercises to watch the confrontation. Tom set down his tools and walked over to where Vorth was standing at the command console. "I'm not interfering with anything," Tom said calmly. "But if you're having trouble with the scenario, you might want to consider adjusting your formation. Your lead ships are too far ahead of your support vessels." The room went completely silent. A maintenance worker was giving tactical advice to a warrior caste reptilian cadet in front of the entire class. It was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Vorth's scales darkened with rage. "How dare you presume to advise your superiors? What could a weak human possibly know about military strategy?" Tom shrugged. "Nothing, I suppose. I was just making an observation." But as Tom walked back to his maintenance panel, several students noticed something interesting. They looked at Vorth's tactical display and realized that the human's suggestion was actually correct. Vorth's lead ships were indeed too far from their support elements, leaving them vulnerable to the concentrated enemy fire that was destroying them. Professor Helt, who had been observing the exercise from the instructor's booth, watched this exchange with growing certainty. Tom's casual assessment of the tactical situation had been not just correct, but showed a level of strategic understanding that surpassed most of the students in the room. After the simulation ended, Professor Helt approached Tom privately. "That was an interesting observation about fleet formations," the professor said carefully. "Where did you learn about military tactics?" Tom was replacing components in a holographic projector, his hands working with practiced efficiency. "Just picked things up over the years, Professor. You hear a lot of talk when you work on military installations." "Yes, I imagine you do. Professor Helt replied. Still, your understanding seems quite advanced for someone who simply overhears conversations. Tom finished his repair work and looked directly at Professor Helt. For just a moment, the elderly, energy being saw something in the human's eyes that made his entire form flicker with recognition. It was the look of someone who had seen real combat, who had made life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Sometimes people notice more than others realize, Tom said quietly, and then he gathered his tools and left the simulation room. Admiral Corvin received a report that evening about unusual activity in the Academy's computer networks. Someone had been accessing tactical databases and strategic planning files, but the access was so skillfully done that it had taken weeks for the security systems to detect it. Whoever was responsible had intimate knowledge of military computer security and had been very careful to cover their tracks. The Admiral studied the security reports and noticed something that made him pause. The mysterious computer access had occurred during the same time periods when certain areas of the Academy had received system upgrades. Someone was using high-level military clearance codes to access classified information, while simultaneously improving the Academy's infrastructure. It was the kind of operation that would require extensive training, sophisticated technical knowledge, and access to resources that no ordinary person would possess. Admiral Corvin began to wonder if there was more to the Academy's recent improvements than simple maintenance upgrades. But before he could investigate further, news arrived that would change everything. A diplomatic convoy, carrying important representatives from several alien governments, was scheduled to visit the Academy the following week. The visit would require all of the Academy's attention and resources, leaving no time to pursue mysteries about system upgrades and maintenance workers. Admiral Corvin filed the security reports for later investigation and began preparing for the diplomatic visit. He had no way of knowing that the mysterious figure he was searching for would soon reveal himself in ways that none of them could have imagined. The diplomatic convoy arrived at Centauri Station with enough ceremony to impress even the most jaded alien dignitaries. Representatives from 12 different civilizations had come to tour the Galactic Military Academy, including several high-ranking officials whose decisions would shape interstellar policy for decades to come. Tom watched the arrival from a maintenance corridor window, noting the security arrangements and escort formations with the practiced eye of someone who understood such things. The convoy included 3 massive diplomatic ships surrounded by a protective fleet of smaller vessels. It was an impressive display of peaceful cooperation between species that had been at war with each other less than a century ago. But Tom also noticed things that the official security teams had missed. The formation was slightly wrong for defending against certain types of attacks. The escort ships were positioned to protect against conventional threats, but would be vulnerable to more creative tactics. He made a mental note to stay alert during the visit, though he hoped his concerns were unnecessary. The first day of the diplomatic tour went smoothly. The alien representatives were impressed by the Academy's facilities and the progress being made in training the next generation of military leaders. They observed classes, toured the simulation centers, and attended formal dinners with the faculty and senior cadets. Tom remained invisible during these events, continuing his maintenance duties while carefully monitoring the visitors and their security arrangements. He had learned long ago that the best way to protect people was to be present but unnoticed, ready to act if something went wrong. On the second day of the visit, something did go wrong. The attack came without warning during the afternoon tour of the Academy's weapons research facility. Space pirates, somehow knowing the exact timing of the diplomatic visit, emerged from hyperspace in a coordinated assault on Centauri Station. Their ships were fast and heavily armed, designed for quick strikes against valuable targets. Emergency. Alarms blared throughout the Academy as the pirate fleet opened fire on the diplomatic convoy. Several escort ships were destroyed in the first few seconds of the attack, and the massive diplomatic vessels found themselves under heavy assault from multiple directions. Tom was repairing equipment in the main corridor when the attack began. The first explosions knocked him to the floor and sent debris flying through the air. As he struggled to his feet, a piece of twisted metal caught his uniform and tore it completely open from collar to waist. This time, There was no hiding the tattoo on his neck. The geometric patterns were fully visible now, dark lines forming complex shapes that seemed to tell a story across his skin. Professor Helt, who was helping evacuate students through the same corridor, saw the tattoo clearly and stopped moving as if he had been struck by lightning. The patterns were unmistakable to anyone who knew military history. They were Voidwalker marks, the legendary tattoos earned by members of humanity's most elite Special Forces unit. Professor Helt had studied those marks in classified historical documents, but he had never expected to see them on a living person. Voidwalkers were more than just soldiers. They were humans who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions in the galaxy, operations so classified that most species refused to believe they had actually happened. They worked alone in the deepest parts of space, behind enemy lines, in situations where failure meant not just death, but the potential destruction of entire civilizations. The specific patterns on Tom's neck told Professor Helt exactly which operations he had participated in. The geometric shapes near his collarbone indicated involvement in the siege of Omega Nebula, where a single human unit had somehow held off an entire enemy fleet long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The interconnected lines along his throat showed participation in the deep strike on Titan's Rest, a mission so secret that official records claimed it had never occurred. But most shocking of all were the complex patterns that wrapped around the back of Tom's neck. Those marks could only mean one thing. Tom had been part of the legendary Phantom campaign, a series of operations where human operatives had allegedly infiltrated hostile civilizations and neutralized threats that could have destroyed multiple star systems. As Professor Helt stood frozen in recognition, Tom was already moving with the kind of fluid precision that no maintenance worker should possess. He assessed the tactical situation in seconds, analyzing the pirate attack patterns and the Academy's defensive capabilities with professional expertise. "Professor, get the students to the secured areas in sections 5 and 6, Tom said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a senior military commander. "Those locations have the best structural integrity and multiple escape routes." Without waiting for a response, Tom began coordinating the Academy's defense as if he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He moved through the corridors with purpose, appearing wherever the situation was most desperate, organizing evacuations and directing defensive efforts with tactical knowledge that impressed even Admiral Corvin. The Admiral himself was commanding. The Academy's response from the main control center, when reports began coming in about a maintenance worker who seemed to know more about military strategy than most of his officers. At first, Corvin dismissed the reports as confusion caused by the emergency situation, but as the battle continued, it became impossible to ignore the fact that someone was systematically improving their defensive coordination. Tom appeared in the control center during the height of the battle, his torn uniform making his tattoo visible to everyone present. Admiral Corvin took one look at the Voidwalker marks and felt his world shift completely. "Commander," the Admiral said, using Tom's proper rank for the first time in 3 years. "Your assessment of the situation?" Tom moved to the tactical display without hesitation, his civilian disguise finally abandoned completely. "The pirates know our defensive patterns too well. Someone provided them with detailed intelligence about our capabilities and the diplomatic visit timing. This isn't a random attack." He manipulated the display with expert efficiency, showing Admiral Corvin weaknesses in their current defensive formation that no ordinary person would have noticed. "They're using our own protocols against us," Tom continued. "But they don't know about the system improvements I've made over the past 3 years. We can use those modifications to create tactical advantages they won't expect." Working together, Tom and Admiral Corvin coordinated a defense that turned the tide of the battle. Tom's intimate knowledge of the Academy's upgraded systems allowed them to deploy defensive measures that the pirates had no way to anticipate. The attack that should have been a devastating success for the pirates became a costly failure that sent them retreating into hyperspace. When the immediate danger had passed, Tom found himself standing in the control center surrounded by alien officers who were seeing him clearly for the first time. The quiet maintenance worker was gone, replaced by Commander Thomas Reed, a decorated Voidwalker whose service record was classified at levels that most of them had never even heard of. Professor Helt approached him with a mixture of respect and amazement. "The Phantom Campaign," the professor said quietly. "The operations in the void sectors, the deep strike missions that officially never happened. You were part of all of it." Tom nodded, no longer trying to hide his identity. "Among other things. But why here?" Admiral Corvin asked. "Why spend 3 years disguised as a maintenance worker at a military academy?" Tom looked around the control center at the alien officers who were waiting for his answer. These beings came from species that had once viewed humans as primitive, newcomers to galactic civilization. Now they were looking at him with the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary heroes. "Because this academy trains the future leaders of a dozen civilizations," Tom said simply. "The children of presidents, admirals, and prime ministers from across known space. If something happened to them, it could destabilize the entire galactic political structure." He gestured toward the tactical display which still showed the aftermath of the pirate attack. "Someone has been planning this assault for months, possibly years. They knew exactly when the diplomatic convoy would arrive, what our defensive capabilities were, and how to exploit our weaknesses. That kind of intelligence gathering requires long-term preparation and inside knowledge." Admiral Corvin understood immediately. "You weren't just maintaining equipment, you were conducting a security investigation." "Among other things," Tom replied. "The system upgrades were necessary to improve our actual defenses, but they also allowed me to monitor all communications and data transfers. I've been building a profile of potential security threats while ensuring that the most important young people in the galaxy could learn and grow safely." Tom pulled his torn collar higher, though it was pointless now that everyone had seen his tattoo. "The attack today confirms what I've suspected for months. There's an organized effort to destabilize galactic peace, and they're targeting the next generation of leaders. This won't be the last attempt." As Tom spoke, the alien officers around him began to understand that they had been in the presence of one of humanity's greatest protectors for 3 years, without ever knowing it. The quiet maintenance worker who had cleaned their corridors and repaired their equipment had actually been standing guard over them, ready to sacrifice himself if necessary to keep them safe. The revelation changed everything, but it also raised new questions. If Commander Thomas Reed was here, conducting a covert security operation, then the threats facing the galaxy were much more serious than anyone had realized. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the enemies who had failed in today's attack were already planning their next move. The Academy's main assembly hall had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. Representatives from 12 different civilizations sat alongside faculty, staff, and students, all waiting to hear the truth about the human who had protected them in secret for 3 years. Admiral Corvin stood at the podium, preparing to reveal information that would fundamentally change how many species viewed humanity's role in galactic civilization. Tom sat in the front row, no longer trying to hide behind his maintenance worker disguise. His torn uniform had been replaced with a simple civilian outfit, but the Voidwalker tattoo on his neck was clearly visible to everyone in the room. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't trying to be invisible. Professor Helt moved to the podium first, his energy form flickering with emotion as he prepared to address the assembly. The elderly being had spent decades studying military history, and he was perhaps the only person present who truly understood the significance of what they had discovered. "Many of you have heard stories about human special forces," Professor Helt began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Most civilizations have legends about their greatest warriors. But the Voidwalkers were something different. They were humans who volunteered for missions that other species considered impossible." The professor activated a holographic display that showed star charts from the early days of human expansion into the galaxy. Red markers indicated conflict zones where conventional military forces had failed to achieve their objectives. The Voidwalker program was created to handle situations where normal diplomatic or military solutions were inadequate, Professor Helt continued. These operatives worked alone, often for months or years at a time, in the most dangerous regions of space. They prevented wars before they could start, eliminated threats that could have destroyed entire civilizations, and saved countless lives through actions that officially never happened. Cadet Nira, sitting with the other students, watched Tom's face as Professor Helt spoke. The human's expression remained calm, but she could see the weight of memory in his eyes. These weren't just historical events to him. They were personal experiences that had shaped his life. The tattoos you see on Commander Reed's neck tell the story of his service, Professor Helt explained, gesturing toward Tom. Each pattern represents a different operation, a different sacrifice made for the greater good of galactic civilization. The professor highlighted specific sections of the tattoo in the holographic display, explaining their significance to the stunned audience. The Siege of Omega Nebula, where Commander Reed and his unit held off an entire enemy fleet for 6 days while civilian evacuations were completed. The Deep Strike on Titan's Rest, where he infiltrated a terrorist organization that was planning to destroy 3 colony worlds. The Phantom Campaign, a series of operations so classified that most governments still refuse to acknowledge they occurred. As Professor Helt continued his explanation, the alien representatives began to understand that they were in the presence of someone whose actions had directly impacted the safety and stability of their own civilizations. The quiet maintenance worker they had ignored for 3 years was a living legend whose service record included some of the most important covert operations in galactic history. Admiral Corvin took the podium next, his military bearing commanding immediate attention from everyone present. Commander Reed came to this academy under deep cover as part of a long-term security investigation, the Admiral announced. Intelligence reports suggested that someone was planning coordinated attacks against the academy and its students. The diplomatic visit provided the perfect opportunity for our enemies to strike. The Admiral activated security recordings from the pirate attack, showing how Tom had coordinated the Academy's defense with professional expertise that had saved hundreds of lives. For 3 years, Commander Reed maintained his cover while systematically improving our security systems and monitoring potential threats. His presence here prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on the future leaders of 12 different civilizations. Cadet Vorth, the reptilian student who had spent months harassing Tom, sat in stunned silence as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had been trying to intimidate one of the most dangerous humans in the galaxy, someone who could have ended him without effort, but had chosen restraint instead. When Admiral Corvin finished his presentation, he invited Tom to address the assembly. Tom stood slowly and walked to the podium, facing an audience that was seeing him clearly for the first time. I know many of you are wondering why I chose to remain hidden for so long, Tom began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. The truth is, the best way to protect people is often to remain invisible. If you don't know a guardian is there, neither do your enemies. He looked around the assembly hall, making eye contact with representatives from different species who had spent their careers viewing humans as junior partners in galactic civilization. Humans aren't the strongest or fastest or smartest species in the galaxy, Tom continued. But we have one advantage that has served us well in the void between stars. We're willing to stand guard in the darkness while others sleep safely. We don't need recognition or glory. We just need to know that the people we protect have the chance to build something better. Tom's words resonated through the hall as alien representatives began to understand that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their willingness to sacrifice themselves quietly for the greater good. David, the human cadet Tom had helped with his homework months earlier, stood up from his seat. Commander, will you be staying at the academy as an instructor? Tom smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression most of them had ever seen from him. The immediate threat has been neutralized, but there are other places in the galaxy where a quiet human observer might be needed. My work here is complete. Professor Helt spoke up from his seat. Commander, before you leave, I think the students would benefit from understanding how you managed to remain undetected for so long. Your operational security was flawless. Tom nodded thoughtfully. The key to deep cover isn't just changing your appearance or your background story, it's changing how people see you entirely. I became exactly what everyone expected a human maintenance worker to be: invisible, unremarkable, and beneath notice. He gestured toward the alien students in the audience. Each of your species has unconscious biases about other races. Reptilians expect humans to be weak, Silicon-based beings assume we're intellectually limited. Energy beings think we're primitive. I use those expectations as camouflage. Cadet Vorth finally found the courage to speak. Commander, I owe you an apology. My behavior toward you was inexcusable. Tom looked at the young reptilian with understanding rather than anger. You treated me exactly as I needed to be treated to maintain my cover. In a way, your harassment actually helped verify that my disguise was working. The response surprised everyone, including Vorth himself. Instead of resentment, Tom showed only professional appreciation for how the situation had served his mission, objectives. As the assembly concluded, representatives from different civilizations approached Tom to express their gratitude and offer him positions within their own military organizations. Tom politely declined each offer, explaining that his current assignment required him to remain independent. Nira was among the last to approach him, her crystalline form ringing softly with curiosity. Commander, how did you know I was investigating you? Tom smiled. Your research patterns in the computer system were very thorough, but you accessed files in a specific sequence that indicated you were building a profile of a particular individual. Plus, you started watching me more carefully after the plasma conduit incident. Were you concerned that I might expose your identity? Actually, I was impressed by your investigative skills, Tom replied. You might consider a career in intelligence work. The galaxy needs people who can see patterns that others miss. As evening approached, Tom packed the few personal belongings he had accumulated during his 3 years at the academy. His small quarters looked exactly as they had when he first arrived, simple and unremarkable. But everything had changed now that his true identity was known. Admiral Corvin visited him as he prepared to leave. Commander, I have to ask, the system improvements you made over the past 3 years, the security upgrades, the enhanced protocols, how much of the Academy's current capabilities are due to your modifications? Tom finished packing and turned to face the Admiral. Probably about 70%. The original systems were adequate for a school, but not for protecting the future. Leaders of galactic civilization. I brought them up to military standards. And the intelligence network you mentioned? The investigation into potential threats? Still ongoing, Tom replied. The pirate attack was just one part of a larger conspiracy. There are other operations in motion, other targets being planned. But that's a problem for another time and another assignment. As Tom prepared to leave Centauri Station, students and faculty gathered in the main corridor to see him off. The same hallways where he had once moved invisibly were now lined with beings from across the galaxy who wanted to express their gratitude. The human cadets seemed especially affected by the revelation. For years they had struggled to prove themselves worthy of inclusion in the Academy's elite programs. Now they had an example of what humans could achieve when they dedicated themselves to protecting others. Tom walked through the corridor one last time, but now he moved with the confident bearing of a decorated military commander, rather than the hunched posture of a maintenance worker. His collar was high, hiding his tattoo once again, but everyone who saw him understood exactly who he was and what he represented. At the docking bay, a simple transport ship waited to take Tom to his next assignment. As he boarded the vessel, Admiral Corvin offered a final salute. The galaxy is safer because of people like you, Commander. Tom returned the salute with military precision. The galaxy is safer because of places like this Academy, Admiral. Keep training the next generation. They're going to inherit challenges we can't even imagine yet. As the transport ship departed Centauri Station, Tom settled into his seat and pulled out a data pad containing information about his next assignment. Somewhere in the Outer Rim territories, there were reports of unusual activity that required investigation. Another situation where a quiet human observer might be able to make a difference. Tom adjusted his collar to hide his tattoo and began reading the mission briefings. By the time he reached his destination, he would once again be just another unremarkable human, invisible and forgotten by everyone around him. But the students and faculty at the Galactic Military Academy would never forget the lesson they had learned. Sometimes the most important guardians are the ones you never see, standing watch in the shadows while others build the future in the light. and somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, other quiet humans continued their vigil, protecting a galaxy that would never know their names but would always benefit from their sacrifice.